Last time we described how the German units were on their last legs, and how that was the given reason for why they were forced to stop. But I suggested that there was another reason, often left out in the history books, that may be a better explanation for the failure of Pallas's second offensive. Not only does this other reason explain why they stopped, but also why they didn't have enough manpower, or why they didn't have enough tanks, or why they didn't have enough ammunition. The battle in Stalingrad is currently taking place in conditions of shortage of ammunition. In 51st Army Corps, 2nd Werfer Regiment can no longer take part in the assault on the city due to this shortage. Arrival of small loads of ammunition is possible in the next 6 to 12 days. Also, there are few shells left for light and especially heavy howitzers, which are very actively spent in city battles and on the northern front. There are not enough shells for assault guns, long barrels, which is especially important given the composition of 50% of the army's assault guns. The next day, the Chief of the Operational Department of the Army draws attention to the fact that the offensive in Stalingrad planned for the 25th of September may not take place unless the situation with ammunition, especially regarding heavy mortars, is improved. And a few days later, we could no longer shoot with the machine gun because ammunition was too scarce. Whoever had a dangerous target was allowed to draw a cartridge out of the machine gun belt and fire with the rifle. Every shot must count. Talking about their artillery, our barrels were fairly worn out and ammunition was inadequate. Bergstrom, Kershaw and Ziemke all note that ammunition supply was in a critical position by late September. Although there do appear to be exceptions. For the attack on the 24th of September, the 71st Infantry Division had been accompanied by a battery of anti-aircraft artillery guns. And the reason why was because they had an unlimited amount of shells, suggesting that they had received a trainload of supplies of anti-aircraft gun ammunition. But it wasn't just ammunition. There was a shortage of tanks. Although this isn't technically true. The 24th Panzer Division actually had enough panzers. The problem wasn't that they needed more tanks, it was that loads of the tanks they had were non-operational. On the 10th of October 1942, the division had a total of 36 operational panzers, had lost a total of 35 panzers in combat, and had an additional 110 repairable panzers that were just sat around in the workshops waiting to be repaired. Yes, 110. They actually had 63 Panzer IIIs lying about that could have worked if they had been repaired, but they couldn't repair them because there was a shortage of spare parts. So they didn't need more tanks, they just needed more spare parts. And it wasn't just tanks. 8th Flieger Corps had suffered a small daily attrition rate made worse by what Bergstrom describes as the inadequate supply of spare parts. Hayward says the same thing about Luftflotte 4. There was a quicker than expected consumption of reserve stocks of spare parts and equipment, supply difficulties and attrition rates. When Blau began, the fleet possessed approximately 1,600 aircraft, of which over 1,150 were operational. After 11 weeks of non-stop operations with insufficient replacement aircraft and spare parts arriving at forward airfields, it now possessed about 950 planes, a mere 550 of them operational. That is, the fleet's total strength had decreased by 40% and its operational rate by 14% from 71 to 57. And just to make this clear, even though there were less aircraft to service, they had less aircraft operational. So losses alone don't explain the drop in operational aircraft. If most of the 950 aircraft were still operational, then that would suggest that combat losses alone were the factor. But because many of them were not in working order, that points to a lack of replacement parts and thus supply issues, which is backed up by other accounts. In addition, there's a quote from Churikov's memoirs that is quite intriguing. The Luftwaffe kept up a constant, concentrated air attack on our troops, on the ferries, and on the Army HQ command post. The German aeroplanes dropped not only bombs, but also pieces of metal, ploughs, tractor wheels, harrows, and empty metal casks, which whistled about the heads of our troops. Why would they drop various bits of metal? Why not bombs? Is it because they didn't have enough bombs to drop, so they were making do with what they had available? Well, Hayward disputes the claim that the Luftwaffe dropped pieces of metal, although he does say that there was a bomb shortage, confirming that there was supply problems. However, I would like to point out that it wasn't just Churikov saying that the German planes weren't dropping bombs. The German planes dropped burning fuel. All of Mamayev Kurgan was enveloped with fire, the ground was on fire, and everywhere dead bodies were burning too. Obviously, two anecdotal accounts don't necessarily confirm that the Luftwaffe resorted to dropping metal and burning fuel. But given the fact that there was a bomb shortage and an ammunition shortage and a spare parts shortage and other shortages as well, including a manpower shortage, it's not unreasonable to assume that the Luftwaffe may have resorted to dropping farming equipment on the Soviets to make up the shortage. Anton Jolly has also informed me that they did drop metal and empty barrels for psychological reasons. They made demonic noises as they flew through the air. So I am going to disagree with Hayward and say that they did drop metal, but whether that was primarily because of the lack of bombs or whether it was for psychological reasons, it's not certain. Perhaps it is both. I've been over the manpower shortage in episode 24 of this series, so I'm not going to labour over that again, but as a reminder, Army Group B, the one on the Don which 6th Army was a part of, had taken a total of 123,430 casualties in the months of July, August and September 1942. They had received 52,400 replacements, meaning that they had a deficit of 71,030 men at the start of October 1942. In that episode I actually said that there had been poor staff work but also a recruitment issue which caused this issue. However, I mentioned that there was another reason relating to this which I would come back to talk about in the future. Well, here we are, let's talk about it. And to explain all this, I need to point out that there was actually a food shortage for the 6th Army which actually started before they reached the city, as I mentioned back in episode 7. We had shortcomings of all sorts, and our rations were halved too. We got orders to live off the land, but there was barely any agriculture between the Don and the Volga. If we came across a kolkhoz, a collective farm, there was nothing to be found. It was emptied. We couldn't live off the land, but we had been a horse-drawn unit. Slowly but steadily, we would eat our horses, long before we would even reach Stalingrad. Motorised units had it worse. Their cooking pots stayed empty. Hall's account, an infantryman in Stalingrad, also gives the impression that his units sometimes fought on empty stomachs filled with nothing but coffee, or that they were only eating one meal a day. What have you cooked today? Pea soup. Then let's have some. While eating this tasty soup, it occurred to me that I'd had nothing to eat throughout the whole day, not even a bite. At one point my company Truppführer had handed me his field flask and I gulped down a few mouthfuls of lukewarm coffee. Now, under the cover of darkness, every one of us was able to fill up, even the sentries made it after they were relieved. The next day, Hall writes, towards 0400 hours, hot coffee was brought to us at the front. The hot coffee raised our spirits, stilled our hunger pangs, and made the world seem a little rosier. Again, on this day, it appears he only ate one meal in the evening, and there are other instances of this sort of thing throughout his account and in others. Then I celebrated the departure with Hellermann in a rearward regimental bunker. The banquet consisted of potatoes in their jackets, butter and onions, a delicacy after the long weeks of dried vegetables. Yet another says, we hadn't eaten potatoes, vegetables or fruit for many weeks. A supply column that we sent to the Ukraine had not returned. The perpetually scarce petrol was so rare that we Essenholer only brought warm food and coffee, known as YouTube censorship, into the forward positions once a day, and that meant during the night. We need to ask a few questions. Why were they only given pea soup, or dried vegetables, or coffee? Why not something more substantial? You'd think that soldiers would receive fresh meat, veg and bread. Well, this does actually tie into what the official German history says about the food situation. It turns out that there was a shortage of all those things: meat, veg, and bread. Sixth Army's advance into the agriculturally unproductive steppe had led to a quick reduction in the opportunities for it to find its food supplies locally. Serious shortages appeared in the provision of rough and hard fodder for the army's horses, numbering over 100,000, and in potato and vegetable supplies for the troops. Cattle stocks also diminished towards the east. By September, a regular meat supply from within the area of operations was scarcely possible any longer. By October, however, the army depended on the bringing up of huge treks of cattle from areas further back. As it was doubtless whether these would reach the army area before the onset of the muddy period, supplies of some 1,500 tons of canned meat per month now became an urgent necessity. Stocks of flour and bread grain, sufficient until September, ran out the following month, largely also because of the shrinking of the army area, so that the army was almost completely dependent on supplies of flour being brought up to the front. And this goes right back to what we talked about in part 2 of episode 1 of this series. One of Hitler's main beliefs was that he hated international Jewish finance, which he believed aimed to starve Germany in order to usher in a Marxist revolution that would wipe out the Aryans and destroy civilization. To stop this, Hitler would make Germany self-sufficient in resources by conquering the lands of the East, enslaving the people there, and then he would extract the food and oil that the industrial German heartland needed to prosper. But until this happened, Germany would suffer a food shortage. There was also an oil crisis, which caused a logistical crisis, which meant that the German army in the East would be forced to live off the land. The problem is that the steppe around Stalingrad doesn't have enough food to feed the 6th Army. Part of this might be because the Red Army had attempted to scorch the earth as it retreated, even going so far as to pour petrol on grain supplies, or it could just be because the steppe itself wasn't abundant with food sources. Either way, the 6th Army couldn't get enough food locally, and therefore had to get it from Germany, which is a problem in itself because their supply lines stretched right back to Berlin. The supply lines extended and we were undersupplied. Consequently, the hunger started long before we even reached Stalingrad in the Don steppe. The German official history describes how the demand for food from the Reich placed an impossible burden on the 3 single-track railway lines that supplied the 3 armies in the area: 3rd Romanian 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army. Just to note, the 6th Army only had one railway line, which had only been converted to the German gauge as far as Chur station. Coupled with Soviet partisans and a shortage of coal, there was a tailback of several hundred trains, which had formed by the beginning of October in the rear area over a distance of some 2,000 kilometers to the German frontier. Drastic measures over the next few weeks succeeded only partially in reducing that backlog. Thus, in October, the 6th Army, despite its priority, was receiving on average only 4.5 trainloads a day instead of the planned 8 to 10. The 6th Army's quartermaster reacted by trying to improve the logistical situation in any way he could. In fact, there was a bottleneck at the Don, where supplies had to be offloaded from the trains and shipped to the front on trucks and carts, causing complications and delays. On the 30th of September, the 6th Army's diary records, "The Army suggests that the Army Group first of all restore the damaged railway bridge across the Don at Rechovsky, for which it is necessary to send the necessary equipment to the railway sappers. The Army asks to restore this bridge in a double-track form, as it will be necessary for the efficient supply of the Army in winter." But, as the German official history notes, conveyance of goods across the Don at Rychkov was possible only by a makeshift bridge. Construction of a solid railway bridge had to be put off because transportation of the structural parts, approximately 70 trainloads, would have been possible only at the expense of 6th Army's indispensable supply trains. And it wasn't just railway issues. The wear and tear on 6th Army's motor vehicles meant that they needed spare parts, but because the 6th Army prioritised things like food and ammunition, the spare parts were few and far between, resulting in a deterioration of the lorries needed to shift supplies to the front. Thus, more and more frequently, horse and ox-drawn wagons had to be used, and this had a knock-on effect too. It was a good job we had these small wooden flatbeds that we call pangy wagons. They were each pulled by a pair of shaggy ponies. When they bogged down, 4 to 6 powerful fists grabbed the spokes and the wagon was back on the road again. How difficult it had been in such instances for our company battle wagon pulled by horses. They were perfect in Central and Western Europe with their good road network, but here in extreme Eastern Europe they were not at all suitable. The condition of our well-nourished horses was noticeably deteriorating because we were not always able to give them the fodder they needed to remain strong. It was a different matter with the small pangy ponies. They were undemanding, yet continued to perform well. We didn't have much trouble procuring fodder for them. In addition, the little comrades required less of it. The German official history confirms Hull's account by saying that by mid-October, 6th Army's horses were in a dire shape and that some divisions had already begun to slaughter the horses for food. Yes, they were slaughtering the horses in October, well before the 6th Army was surrounded. The official German history then states that the steppe grass wasn't of much nutritional value for the horses, and supplies of fodder were inconsistent. It also describes how the 6th Army's quartermaster reported on the 20th of October that if the supply situation didn't improve, only half of the horses would survive the winter. And of course, relying on My Little Ponies as your primary means to get supplies from the railheads to the fighting troops wasn't ideal. Considerable quantities of supplies were sometimes left lying uncollected at the railways, while a few hundred kilometres away the fighting fronts were short of the most indispensable items. Except for the cattle treks, which ensured fresh meat reserves until about the middle of December, there was no question, well into November, of any significant stocking up of foodstuffs for the winter. On the contrary, and this I think is the crucial point here, incoming supplies of potatoes and vegetables, fat, sugar and spreads for bread often failed to meet day-to-day requirements, so that several modest attempts to build up stocks had to be abandoned even before the onset of winter. Yes, that's right, the 6th Army couldn't build up a reserve of supplies even before the winter. In fact, they were already in a deficit, with their men already on a restrictive diet. Beginning in October, the growing discrepancy between physical demands and nutritional shortfalls resulted in a perceptible deterioration in the strength of the fighting forces. Serious consideration was given to the idea of suspending the attack on the northern part of Stalingrad because, even at the expense of supplies of ammunition and fuel, the troops must first of all be provided with food. All of this explains why there was shortages of everything. The lack of local food caused a shortage which could only be fulfilled by shipments of food from Germany, but this ate into the available capacity of the overburdened and overstretched railways, which were badly organised anyway. The result was that the 6th Army was barely receiving enough food or ammunition or other supplies. In October, instead of the authorised quota of 850 cubic metres of ammunition, the army had received an average daily amount of only 456 cubic metres. Further severe restrictions were announced for November. In order to ensure at least the most necessary operations, consumption by other users had to be cut back to such an extent that repair services, convoys and other supply facilities were largely paralysed. Worse, supplies of ammunition and fuel had long been insufficient to cover day-to-day needs. Any long-term stocking up was therefore out of the question. Fritz confirms this. Already in October, i.e. before the onset of winter, the 6th Army was on average receiving less than half its required daily trainloads of supplies. The dire logistical situation explains why large quantities of panzers were sitting in repair shops at this point. It explains why there was shortages of ammunition, why the Luftwaffe may have been dropping ploughs and other metal equipment, and why the men weren't receiving enough food. It also helps explain why the 6th Army had a manpower crisis. If you don't have enough food and ammunition for the men you already have, adding more men will only exacerbate the problem. So it would make sense to not send the 6th Army additional manpower, and instead tell them to transfer soldiers and officers from the non-essential rear services units to the front line. An instruction was sent to all corps. The current situation requires sending the maximum number of personnel to the active forces. In connection with this, the Corps Staff Services need to reduce all non-indispensable posts. The Führer issued an order according to which it is permitted to affect as many prisoners of war as possible to auxiliary posts, drivers, assistant drivers in convoys, auxiliary workers, technical repair and labour personnel in the supply and construction divisions. Considering that prisoners of war, Hiwis, were often not given the same amount of food as the Germans, it makes sense to use them instead of another German soldier. Plus, shipping them back to the Reich would only increase the food difficulties there. Hitler then complained that the combat strength of the units were low, and, on the 8th of October, asked his army commanders to provide him with their ration and combat strengths. On the 17th of October, the 6th Army reported that it had a total ration strength of 334,000 men, but its combat strength was just 66,549 men. This doesn't include 4th Panzer Army's units that were subordinated to the army. So, did they send additional manpower to the front? Maybe a little, but instead, Zeitzler issued a companion directive to all German army commands ordering an immediate 10% reduction in headquarters personnel from army group down to divisions. The respective commands were to send the manpower thus freed to the front as combat troops. Thunderball Zeitzler also ordered that commands reduce their rear area support personnel in proportion to frontline combat losses and send those freed soldiers forward as replacements. At the same time, because of the desperate supply problems, from September, 6th Army's quartermasters were arguing for the army to withdraw from Stalingrad. This was partly why both Paulus and von Weichs were asking if they could withdraw the 6th Army behind the Don. Zeitzler seems to have raised these problems several times with Hitler. I'd like to point out though that it's doubtful that a withdrawal of this length would really have solved any of 6th Army's logistical problems. It might have helped slightly, but the logistical considerations don't appear to be the reason why this was suggested. As I said in the last episode, this proposal to withdraw was more likely to do with pressing the High Command to send them operational reserves. And even though historians like Kershaw and the official German history have blamed Madman Hitler for not allowing this withdrawal, saying that he wanted to stay in the city for prestige reasons, Hitler himself does seem to have been concerned about what was happening. To answer why the armies in the east had stopped, Hitler said this in his speech on the 30th of September 1942. There are 10,000s, and again 10,000s of kilometers of railroads that we either will repair or which we have already repaired a long time ago, thanks to the diligence, hard work and dedication of many 10,000s of German soldiers, railroad engineers, men of the Todt organization and other organizations, the Reich Labor Service and so on. The huge traffic network, which today runs on German gauges for the most part, was completely destroyed. Not hundreds but thousands of bridges had to be newly built, craters or mines had to be eliminated, crossings had to be newly set up. All this was accomplished in a few months and will be finished in a few weeks. Now, my party comrades, you will understand one thing. When people on our enemy's side say, "Why did they stop all of a sudden?" then I can only reply, because we are careful, because we do not run to Benghazi only to have to run back again, but because we stop somewhere until our supply lines are back in order. I know that the German folk in its entirety has had up to now such boundless faith in its military leaders and in the accomplishments of its soldiers that it knows that there is always a reason for stopping. Not only do we put traffic in order on the tracks, but we must also build roads, since the blessed land of the proletarians and peasants regrettably does not have any roads, but only fragments of roads. The first truly mighty roads are being built now by our organizations there. Behind this, we are also organizing agriculture. After all, the area is supposed to be developed, and that is not easy, since it is not a question of simply sowing and harvesting. Rather, it is a question of making use of, that is, transporting these products across vast distances to a railroad where they can be loaded. Finally, we must restructure part of this economy. Thousands of tractors which were either damaged or eliminated must be improved or replaced by other means. I can only tell you, what has been accomplished here is simply incredible. While the front is fighting, a few kilometers behind it, the same soldiers work with sickle and scythe, cultivate the fields again, and behind them the operational staffs of our agricultural organizations move up. Obviously, a lot of this is propaganda. The soldiers were stealing food, not sowing it, and they weren't forced to stop because they were careful, but because they had run out of fuel and were running at the end of their overstretched supply lines. Yet, as tempting as it is to blame Madman Hitler for all of this, and for not allowing a withdrawal from Stalingrad, let's think about this for a moment. Halder had said that the Battle of Stalingrad would be over in 10 days. It was well over 10 days since then, but they had little more than half the city in their hands. Thousands of German soldiers had perished in the city already, and Soviet forces were on their last legs prior to the recent reinforcements. The Germans had cut off the Volga, and they dominated the skies. Okay, they did have logistical problems, but they didn't have the benefit of hindsight. We know what's coming. We know what will happen in mid-November. But nobody at the time did. Everything that they had fought for so far, if they abandoned the city, would simply be abandoned to the enemy, who wasn't actually taking it from them by force. The Germans would be handing the captured portions of the city back to them without a fight. Is this really an option? Are we really to take seriously the suggestion that the Germans should have just abandoned the city right now? Looking at it from a purely military point of view, it doesn't make sense. Now that they've taken half the city, they may as well keep going. If they were worried about not taking the city in time before winter, or before their logistics broke down, then they shouldn't have entered the city in the first place. But they had entered the city, thanks to Halder, and so now they were committed. Therefore, blaming Madman Hitler alone for this isn't sufficient. Yes, he takes full responsibility for what happened, but the German generals are equally as guilty. And it's only with the benefit of hindsight that we can say it was a bad idea to stay in the city. It wasn't so obvious at the time. Regardless of who is to blame though, the main takeaway here is that the history books all point to a lack of manpower in Paulus's 6th Army and say that that's the reason why his second offensive inside Stalingrad failed. But the manpower crisis itself was but one of the symptoms of a much bigger logistical crisis that was having significant effects even on the troops themselves, who were weakened through hunger. You can't send men to the front if you can't give them the food and ammunition they need to fight. So I would argue that it wasn't just the manpower crisis that caused Paulus's second offensive to stall, but it was the wider logistical crisis and of course Soviet resistance. The Germans actually had enough manpower, tanks, spare parts and other things, apart from fuel, but they couldn't send it all to the front, weakening their forces in the face of the stubborn Red Army defenders. And this goes right back to things like the planning for Fall Blau, or even Barbarossa, as well as the fuel crisis, the inefficiency and neglect of the Reichsbahn, National Socialism's autarky and economic policies, the inability to make economic calculations without free market prices, and Adolf Hitler's entire Weltanschauung worldview, as he outlined in Mein Kampf and his unpublished second book, plus his speeches and table talks and so forth. The reason why the 24th Panzer Division had 110 non-operational panzers, or a lack of manpower, or a lack of ammunition, and the reason why the Luftwaffe bombers they were calling in as support were supposedly dropping plows and other farming equipment, lies in the politics and economics. Historians have neglected the political and economic side of the war for too long, so stop ignoring it, and stick to banks. On the 5th of October 1942, all was quiet on the Stalingrad front. Sort of. Zhukov's second Kotlebane offensive had withered and died, and Paulus's second offensive inside the city of Stalingrad had also spluttered to a halt. Shumilov called off his attacks in order to regroup, although the fighting continued south of the city between the 4th Panzer Army and the Soviet 51st and 57th Armies. This had drawn away the 14th Panzer Division and kept the 29th Motorized Division in check, preventing them from moving north to assist the 6th Army in Stalingrad, as Paulus now realised. Without reinforcements, the army is not going to take Stalingrad very soon. The danger exists, were the Russians to make fairly strong counterattacks, our front might not hold, because there are no reserves behind it. The idea of a strong Soviet counterattack was a possibility, because, unlike Paulus, Chuikov was still receiving reinforcements. In addition to the remainder of 37th Guards Rifle Division which now crossed the Volga, Yeremenko ordered Bely's 84th Tank Brigade into the city overnight on the 4th to 5th of October. Bely had more tanks than the whole of the 24th Panzer Division, but unfortunately there weren't enough boats to get them all across, so only 20 T-70s had actually arrived by the morning. Stalin also feared that the Germans were aiming to cross the Volga and encircle the 62nd Army, warning Yeremenko about this possibility. That was why the 45th Rifle Division was also moved to the islands on the Volga to the south of the city, rather than into the city itself. Yeremenko also ordered Chuikov to counterattack, which was silly because his forces were in no position to do that, mainly because they, just like the Germans, had no ammunition. In fact, as a result of the exploding oil tanks, Chuikov had basically lost communication with his troops and spent this night moving his headquarters under mortar fire from the oil tanks region to the north, nearer to the tractor factory. So he didn't have the time nor the capability to prepare for a counterattack, but Yeremenko was compelled to order it anyway because Stalin was reviewing Yeremenko's performance. The enemy intends to take your crossings, encircle 62nd Army and take it captive. In order to avert this danger, you must press the enemy back from the Volga. To do so, it is necessary to convert every building and every street in Stalingrad into a fortress. Unfortunately, you have not succeeded in doing this and are still continuing to give up block after block to the enemy. This testifies to your poor performance. You have more forces in the Stalingrad region than the enemy, and in spite of this, the enemy is continuing to press you. I am dissatisfied with your performance in the Stalingrad front, and I demand you undertake every measure for the defense of Stalingrad. And while most of the units of Zylis's corps had come to a halt, Paulus still wanted to destroy the Orlovka pockets and have 389th Infantry Division catch up to the 24th Panzer Division's spear point. So, under a hail of Stukas, Yenika's men advanced about 400 meters before Zolodev's regiments, plus support from the 20 T-70s of Bely's 84th Tank Brigade and other units, brought them to a halt. Small-scale attacks continued in other sectors, but all were repulsed. A unit of Nebelwerfers were also set up behind Lenski's division to offer help to them, as well as the 276th Infantry Regiment. And the Soviets countered with their own artillery, which fired from across the Volga, aiming at German concentrations with more than 300 guns and heavy mortars plus Katyushas. The barrage lasted for 40 minutes and helped stall the German assaults. It was during this early October period that a communications officer from the 284th Rifle Division began to take a toll on the Germans ahead of him. Alexander Kalentiev's commander had given him permission to go to the front line to hunt down the enemy, which he did, killing 10 Germans in 2 days, including an officer. Although the myth would develop that Vasily Zaitsev was the one who started the sniper movement in Stalingrad, it was actually Alexander Kalentiev who began it in early October and would soon go on to teach Zaitsev the tricks of the trade. It's also worth noting that this was a spontaneous movement, not one created by the centre. It emerged out of the individual man's desire to take revenge on the Germans, and after Kalentiev's initial kills, he inspired others to take up the call, with the Germans acknowledging the results. Russian snipers hit anyone who shows himself carelessly from behind shelter. A few days earlier, on the 3rd of October 1942, An army economic officer reported to the German High Command saying that most of the remaining civilians were women and children, and that many of whom were living in cellars or caves in the ground. Thus, starting on the 5th, the German field police began to round up those remaining civilians, with the males being sent to 2 prison camps, Gulag 205 and the Stalingradinsky POW camp, while about 8,000 to 10,000 women and children were gathered each morning and marched to Kalach without food, water or shelter, and from there they were sent off to the Reich or the Ukraine as slave labour. Many had already started feasting on the dying horses that were lying on the roadside, which had already started dying from about September onwards. Jason DeMark notes that the German soldiers of 24th Panzer Division plus another division plundered the civilians in a degrading way, but that steps were taken against those soldiers. Still, Stalingrad civilians were being ill-treated by the Germans, and many would not see their homes again. On the 6th, the 389th Infantry Division didn't advance at all, and instead spent the day reorganising. The Luftwaffe, though, continued to pound the Soviets, with the 339th Regiment being swarmed and having its entire regimental staff wiped out, including both its commander and commissar. 14th Panzer Corps also put pressure on the Olovka pockets and attempted to attack into the tractor factory settlement as well as Spartanovka, but they were blunted by heavy Katyusha fire and stubborn resistance. The 115th Rifle Regiment's 2nd Battalion were wiped out in this action though, leaving its 1st Battalion to struggle on, and with only minor actions in other sectors, Paulus had no choice but to order his army onto the defensive, rubber stamping what had become a reality, that his forces were too weak now to advance. The OKH staff now informed Hitler that the German army was 1 million men below strength, which he was now concerned over. It was probably this, plus the fact that Paulus had come to a halt, that helped persuade Hitler to postpone the planned advance towards Astrakhan and instead declare that Army Group B's key objective was Stalingrad. This would permit the withdrawal of the 14th Panzer Division, allowing it to redeploy to Stalingrad to help Paulus out. In addition, Paulus also informed General Oppenländer that his division would be relieved by the 76th Infantry Division in a few days' time. Oppenländer would then march his 305th Infantry Division into Stalingrad to reinforce the tattered divisions he already had there. Again, in order to get more infantry into Stalingrad, Paulus had to take another division from the Don flank, which was perhaps not a good idea in the long term. On the other side of the wire, the Stavka asked Yeremenko, Rokossovsky and Khrushchev to give their thoughts on the idea of a new counter-offensive. All 3 of them challenged the old idea of attacking in the Kotlebane region, saying there needed to be a different solution. They suggested that attacks on the flanks would be best, in alignment with their thoughts earlier in September. There was a split between what the generals thought and what Stalin thought. But as this debate was going on, Yeremenko was insisting that Chuikov launch his own counterattack, having received intelligence saying that the Germans would soon resume their offensive on the tractor factory area. By this point, Chuikov had got his communications back in order and agreed to the counterattack, but before he was able to launch it on the 7th, Yenneker launched his own attack, supported by 10 panzers from the 24th Panzer Division and 10 Stugs from the 245th Sturmgeschütz Battalion. Chuikov exaggerated the attack, saying it was a full-scale offensive with 500 panzers, which he later reduced to 80. But that was still too high. There were only 20 if you count the Stugs. Still, 20 armoured vehicles plus infantry were enough to shatter the units in their path, including the fresh 37th Guards Rifle Division, and force them back another 300 metres. The 109th Rifle Regiment and other units with timely Katyusha support managed to stabilise the situation though. To their north, the 267th and 274th Regiments of the 94th Infantry Division also tried to advance, but were stalled by heavy Soviet Katyusha fire. Apparently, according to Chuikov, one of the German battalions in this attack was wiped out by the rocket fire. It could be true, but all the sources I have that mention it are all getting their information from Chirikov, who doesn't say which battalion was wiped out, so it's hard to verify this. Nonetheless, Paulus was forced to halt all his attacks, even the minor ones, in order to rest, refit, and hope for more reinforcements. During the early hours of the 8th of October, a group of about 70 men managed to escape from the 1st Orlovka pocket, with another 120 men from the 2nd also managing to reach friendly lines. The rest, about 3,000 men, had been wiped out in 11 days of fighting. In the centre, Zana shifted some of his units around, moving the 100th Jaeger Division's Cycle Battalion into the area where the 2nd Battalion of the 227th Jaeger Regiment was, allowing it to move north and replace the 1st Battalion of the 54th Jaeger Regiment. So bad was the manpower crisis that the OKH now ordered all headquarters above division level to release 10% of their personnel as replacements, and support units not engaged in fighting were also ordered to form alarm detachments to respond to sudden emergencies. It was also on this day that von Weichs, obeying Hitler's instructions, ordered Paulus to prepare another attack on Stalingrad to be launched no later than the 14th of October. The aim this time would be to seize the tractor factory and the brick factory just below it, then move south and take the Barricadi factory. Paulus, though, and his staff were appalled by this order, knowing that their units were on their last legs. But the 305th Infantry Division had started to be relieved by the 76th Infantry Division, and Opperländer's troops were now marching towards Stalingrad. So Paulus would have additional troops for the upcoming attack. Now, you might think that this would be a good time for both sides to catch their breath and bring up reinforcements. But no. The Stavka ordered Rokossovsky's Don front to resume its attacks to the north of the city. Yes, a third Kotlebane offensive, and the 4th in the area after the original Kotlebane counteroffensive. Because obviously, since the others had been so successful, this one definitely would be, right? Rokossovsky was reluctant to attack since he knew that his men were still fatigued from the previous offensives. He actually went to the trouble of describing the German positions and explaining why they were impossible for his broken forces to overcome. As a result of months of fighting, the rifle divisions of 1st Guards, 24th and 66th Armies are severely weakened and consist of no more than a battalion of bayonets in each division. But it didn't matter, he had to attack, which he dutifully did on the 9th. The 1st Guards and 24th Armies assaulted the German front once more and basically did nothing. In fact, this attack would only last 3 days, dissolving on the 11th of October, having achieved nothing of note. On the one hand, this was probably the weakest of the Kotlebane offensive so far and could probably be classed as a waste of time, at least practically. But on the other hand, Glantz argues that the constant headbutting until exhaustion reminded Paulus about his vulnerable flanks, distracting him and possibly causing him to change his tactics. So, in a sense, this was a sacrifice of thousands of lives just to make the enemy commander worry. I'll let you decide if it was worth it. Now, there is a bit of a debate regarding who came up with the Operation Uranus counteroffensive. In the post-war era, Yeremenko claimed that he was the one who came up with the plan, and his account is backed up by Khrushchev. Yeremenko said that it was on the 9th that he suggested that Rokossovsky shouldn't attack in the Kotlebane region and instead proposed an attack from the Kletskaya and Sirotinskaya areas, aiming for Kalach. He also said that an attack from the lake region south of Stalingrad would meet up with Rokossovsky's forces at Kalach, which would encircle the 6th Army and cut its communications. And Glantz says this was a significant evolution of the counter-offensive plan first devised in late September. Although there were significant differences between Yeremenko's proposals in early October and the final plan for Operation Uranus, archival evidence makes it abundantly clear that Yeremenko himself suggested the general concept for the counter-offensive. Glantz says that prior to this point the idea had been to attack the immediate flanks of 6th Army rather than attacking further away from Stalingrad with the aim to encircle it. and that Yeremenko's proposal may not have been the first time this was discussed, but it was the first time that it stuck, with Stalin seriously considering it for the first time. Glantz also says that Rokossovsky then also gave his recommendations, challenging once again the old idea of attacking in the Kotlebane region and saying there needed to be a different solution. With his generals telling him that the old idea of attacking at Kotlebane was futile, Stalin was therefore convinced by Yeremenko's new solution. But Anton Jolly has explained to me that Yeremenko was distorting what really happened to paint himself in a better light and downplay Zhukov's role in all of this. In fact, Vasilevsky had already informed Yeremenko on the 6th of October that the main lines of operation would be from the flanks of the 6th Army, including the south. Yeremenko then sent his own proposal on the 9th, but it was so bad that Anton Jolly says it's hard to take it seriously. The forces proposed were much too weak, the schedule was completely unrealistic. The cavalry was given the lead role. One of its major objectives was the destruction of the German depots at Kotelnikovo, which looked like a raid without a future. The base for his main strike was Kletskaya, while Serafimovich would be chosen for the real operation. This was why Glantz said that there were significant differences between Yeremenko's proposal and the final Uranus counteroffensive, because what Yeremenko proposed was a joke, and probably didn't influence the final plan much at all, especially because the plan was already being developed by the time Yeremenko submitted his proposal. Isayev comes to a similar conclusion, saying that it was the Stavka and the Soviet General Staff that came up with the plan, and that the plans developed by the front headquarters were of limited value. The plan for a diversionary raid of cyclopean scale, proposed by Yeremenko and Khrushchev, has only a distant relationship to the plan for Operation Uranus. All of Yeremenko's and Khrushchev's claims of authorship are, at best, laughable. So, Glantz is probably incorrect here. Operation Uranus wasn't Yeremenko's plan, it gradually evolved over time, largely as a group effort by the higher commands. However, the 9th of October was perhaps a significant turning point with Stalin himself, who issued an incredibly important order which would have massive ramifications on the Red Army for the rest of the war. This was Order Number 307. Soviet commissars and political officers were finally reduced in power, and for the first time since the 16th of July 1941, Red Army commanders at all levels were given full control of their units. The Red Army now had unity of command, and Stalin's trust. Prior to this point, Stalin hadn't trusted his subordinates. He viewed the army with suspicion, which is why he flooded it with party commissars. Now he gave the army commanders his trust, coincidentally at a time when Hitler was becoming increasingly distrustful of his generals. This meant that the Red Army now had a professional command structure, which would have big consequences moving forward. On the 10th of October, the 3rd Romanian Army had fully deployed in its positions on the Don. It had 171,256 men at this time, but was short on ammunition, provisions, and the German support needed to push their line up to the river itself. Without that natural anti-tank obstacle, Dumitrescu would be vulnerable to a major tank assault. But Hitler, and presumably von Weichs as well, refused to give him support since they had nothing to spare. Everything had to go to the Stalingrad region, including the 79th Infantry Division, which the Romanians had relieved from the Kletskaya region. This and the 305th Infantry Division were on the march towards Stalingrad to reinforce Paulus and get his next offensive on the go. The officers of 305th Infantry Division received training pamphlets detailing how to fight in urban combat. Jason DeMark makes this striking comment in his book Into Oblivion, which is about the 305th Pioneer Battalion of Oppenlander's division. It is generally believed that the Germans were hopeless at urban combat and simply blundered into the city in serried ranks. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Wehrmacht was actually adept at fighting in built-up areas, and any recognised shortcomings were swiftly remedied. The men of the Bodensee Division benefited from the experience of other divisions. The previous night, a 4-man commando squad infiltrated the German lines and cut a telephone cable. When 2 Germans came to repair it, they shot one and knocked out the other. When Private Willy Brandt came to, he blabbed and told his interrogators that Paulus was aiming for the factories with the 24th Panzer and 94th Infantry Divisions. Brandt was then allowed to leave and go back to his unit. Churikov, though, received that information, now understood that the tractor factory and the barricade factories were the aim of Paulus's next attack, and decided to mount local attacks and prepare his defences. On the 11th, the Soviets managed to gain ground on the northern wing of the Croatian battalion, but a swift counterattack sent the Soviets back. Further north, the 84th Tank Brigade, with infantry on top of the tanks, attempted to strike at the Germans. According to Anthony Beaver, when one of the T-34s got mired in a shell hole, a drunk infantry commander flew into a rage, jumped down off the tank, opened the hatch at the front, and fired 2 shots, killing the driver. Despite this enthusiasm, though, the lines didn't budge. But one significant change did occur. Hellermann was transferred back to Germany, with Oberst von Bülow taking charge of the 26th Panzergrenadier Regiment. And Edelsheim was also informed that he would be transferred back to Germany soon as well, although continued to command his Kampfgruppe for now. Further south, a storm group of 35 riflemen from the 34th Guards Rifle Regiment tried to storm the railway workers' buildings and even managed to get inside them. However, after both sides lobbed grenades at each other, German fire from the L-shaped house compelled them to withdraw. This would be the first of many attempts by the Soviet storm groups to retake the houses of railway workers, and probably one of the more successful attempts as well. Despite his own hesitation, under orders from Yeremenko, Churikov launched another counterattack on the 12th of October. He does note, though, that his army had been put on short supplies, which made Churikov realise that a major counter-offensive was being prepared nearby. So he knew that his attacks in the city, as desperate and as futile as they might seem, were necessary to distract the enemy during this time. This was the first hint that a major counterattack was in preparation. Stalingrad, he suddenly realised with mixed emotions, now represented the bait in an enormous trap. Thus, the 114th Regiment of 37th Guards Rifle Division, supported by the 90th Regiment of 95th Rifle Division, attacked, aiming to retake the stadium area. They took a little ground, but ultimately failed in their objective. A similar attack went in against Group Pavichich, but was thwarted by Nebelwerfer barrages. The only other significant event this day was the fact that the 305th Infantry Division was arriving in Stalingrad and began to take up positions just to the north of the 24th Panzer Division. It was on the 13th of October that Zhukov and Vasilevsky submitted their first draft for Operation Uranus to Stalin, and during this time preparations for the counter-offensive had begun, with the Soviets starting to pull units from the other sectors. Stalin, though, was worried about what was happening in Stalingrad and was still frustrated with Yeremenko. He ordered the front commander to go in person to Churikov's headquarters to find out exactly what his position was and what he needed in order to hold on to the city. Yeremenko wouldn't get into Stalingrad until the 16th, but it's clear that the Soviet command still believed that Stalingrad might fall, even at this stage. Churikov therefore was forced to prepare as best he could for Paulus's upcoming attack. He organised detachments of workers' militias inside the tractor factory, the barricade factory, and the Red October factory too. These men, who worked to the last minute repairing weapons and improvising a variety of devices for street fighting, hung ammunition belts across their overalls, picked up grenades, rifles or anti-tank weapons, and still in their working men's flat caps took up positions in the firing points or bunkers with Red Army men. Paulus, meanwhile, was busy assembling his forces for the next attack on the city. German Stukas and artillery began to soften up the Soviet positions ahead of the next assault, due to start the next day, but it appears that not all the ammunition trains had arrived, so there was a shortage of munitions for the upcoming attack. Would Paulus's third offensive inside the city of Stalingrad succeed? Would they take the impressive tractor factory? Would the logistics crisis get better or worse? And would Chuikov hold out with the ragtag formations he had in the area? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.